auditing firms will play a major role, of course, in the ESG-related due diligence procedures. Just think about third-party verifications. Yeah, I just briefly talked about that in my own presentation. And this brings me to our next very esteemed speaker, Ms. Els van Poucke. Els has recently joined Deloitte Legal Belgium as a partner in the commercial and dispute resolution team. During her time in Singapore, Els was the Secretary General of the European Chamber of Commerce Singapore and the President of the Belgium-Luxembourg Business Group. Please take it away, Els.
Yes, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for inviting me. We can go to the next slide immediately. As already explained before this afternoon, the CSDD proposal will actually be important in the first place for large companies. And indeed, SMEs are not impacted immediately, but will certainly be indirectly impacted as a result of the actions that will have to be taken by the larger companies in the EU and outside the EU if they have business and turnover in the European Union. As already stated by Peter, can do the next slide, please. The obligations under this CSDD proposal are actually mandatory due diligence practices in order to identify and to address adverse human rights and environmental impacts. And as you stated already, Adolf, there's quite a huge annex to the proposal, which states what this adverse impact means. It's the violation of rights and prohibitions laid down in international human rights conventions and conventions on human rights and fundamental freedoms. And this takes a few pages. Some examples: child labor, inadequate health and safety in the workplace. And when it comes to environment, the violation of internationally recognized objectives and prohibitions laid down in environmental conventions. Also a few pages, and examples here are, of course, very known pollution and green gas emissions. What do companies under this proposal, you can do the next slide, need to do? They basically need to incorporate due diligence in their policies. So, and what does this due diligence policy need to describe? The company's approach to due diligence, also in the long term. They need to have a code of conduct describing the rules and principles of the company. Most large companies today, they already have such a code of conduct. And of course, employees and other subsidiaries of the company, they need to abide by this code of conduct. But they also need to put a process in place to implement this due diligence. It's not only for the company itself, but also for its established business relationships. What are business relationships? It's defined basically also in the proposal. You can do the next slide. So there's a definition of this business relationship. It's about a contractor, a subcontractor, a legal entity with whom the company has a commercial agreement, or to whom financing, insurance or reinsurance is provided. Or it can also be a business operation related to products or services of the company. But the proposal limits the scope of the due diligence to the company's own operations, its subsidiaries, and its business partners with whom it has an established business relationship. And on the other slide, you will see, and it's also provided, there's a definition in the proposal, what is then an established business relationship? And that is a direct or indirect business relationship of the company which is lasting or expected to be in view of the intensity and the duration. Let's say if the company just has a third supplier and it will only be used once, then it's not an established business relationship. It's about suppliers with whom they have business every day or on a regular basis, with whom they have framework agreements, and it cannot represent a negligible part of the value chain. But they will have to reassess at least every 12 months the company if this business relationship is still established or not. Because as I said, the proposal limits the scope to established business relationships in a value chain. You can do the next slide. I will show you here, and it's a very, very simply, and it's in practice, of course, it will be much more complex, a supply chain, or in the proposal, they do not talk about supply chain, but about value chain. When a product is manufactured, then you have an upstream of the supply chain with different tiers, tier 1, tier 2 suppliers, and even more. In practice, there might be 100 or even thousands of suppliers. And then you have the downstream, where then when the product is manufactured, you will use like one or more or 100 of distributors, logistics partners to finally deliver the product to the customer. In the next slide, you will see another example, also very simplified, of a supply chain in the construction, where you also have different contractors, subcontractors, architects, engineers, and it's much more complex than what you are seeing here. So in this, when companies need to organize due diligence in such a very complicated supply chain, value chain, how are they going to do this? How will they organize this? It's not clear yet. You can do the next slide. It's not clear yet what the standard will be of these due diligence policies. Some of them today, some companies use the OECD due diligence guidance for responsible business conduct, but of course, there are so many basically. Today, there's quite some of larger companies that already put their policies, due diligence policies, on their website. Like for instance, H&M is doing this. They have their business standards and policies on the web, and they describe how they identify, assess, and adverse impact in their operations, in their supply chains. And for example, employees and business partners, they can raise a grievance if they think there's any adverse impact. And then there's, well, they will actually talk to each other and see if it can be solved, if it can be mitigated. And of course, if there's no mitigation possible or no solution, they will finally have to end the contract. And they also have, and that happens a lot, that companies have expert teams in countries where the production is done to check whether everything happens in accordance with their codes of conduct and their due diligence policies. Their codes of conduct, of course, that's something they need to have, but they also need to assure that all these subcontractors in the supply chain will also respect these codes of conduct and also the company's due diligence. So how shall they do this? Well, it would be perfect if they could make this part of the contractual relationship. Nowadays, it's not really a problem. In the main contract, there will be with the first subcontractor in the first tier that they will have to comply with this code of conduct, with the due diligence policy, and they will have to sign it. It will be part of the contract. And most of the time, they will put the liability on the main contractor, that he will need to make sure that the codes of conduct and the due diligence policy are also respected by all the other sub contractors. I will not go into detail because I think there's another topic on this related to how you should reassure that your business partners also are going to respect your code of conduct and your due diligence policy, and that there is contractual cascading in this supply chain, what is provided basically by the proposal directive. What is also important is that companies do not need only to identify these adverse impacts, but they also need to try to mitigate them. And mostly they will have to have prevention plans in place. That, of course, also these contracts and the cascading, they will have to make investments from time to time to make sure that there is no adverse impact or to remediate it. And what is also very important is the independent third-party verification, which will be done probably by indeed independent audit firms, and which happens already today, because large companies, they will not wait for the directive and the legislation to come and to enter into force. And they have a kind of third-party risk management cycle. So what happens is that these firms, they are going to check if a contractor, a main contractor, can enter, well, they will have actually describe the risk to enter into a contract with a third party. So they will check what is the need, what kind of third party do we need, what kind of industry, is it a riskful industry, like sourcing minerals, for example. And they will have an inherent risk questionnaire. In this questionnaire, they will actually see if there's any exposure to an initial level of risk related to the goods. And there will also, artificial intelligence is also often used to collect and examine data from the internet, but also, tools and technology to check whether they, what the risks are related to the product or the service. What happens after is that there will be background checks of the third party. So this third party, what are the financials? Who's the owner of this third party? Because sometimes it might be very complicated. What is their reputation? Is there any adverse media around this third party? And then after this first checks, there will be third parties selected that might be interesting to contract with. And then there will be a third party questionnaire. This is a more detailed questionnaire, actually an audit questionnaire, where these shortlisted third parties will have to give information about many, many, many things related to human rights and environment. For instance, do they have environmental policies? Do they have targets? Have they methods for CO2 emissions? Have they abolition of child labor, elimination of discrimination? Do they have fair working conditions, etc., etc.? Of course, it's one thing to have all this information. Sometimes it's also a very good thing to go on site, to send people on site and to check whether indeed what has been replied to the questionnaire is also really put in place on the floor. Afterwards, the report will be drafted by the independent audit firms. And then, of course, the main contractor will have to take a decision whether or not to enter into a contract. Sometimes it might be possible that mitigation or that certain investments or plans need to be made before they can enter into a contract because some risks have been found. If there is a contract, then, as explained before, it will be necessary that you protect the whole supply chain with the contractual clauses in place. after the contract, it's of course not enough to have then the contract in place. There has to be monitoring, because due diligence has to be there in the whole life cycle with your third party. And if there's a new relationship, you should adapt your due diligence. If there's change in the operations, same thing. And in any case, it has to be done, and that's stated in the directive, every 12 months. It has to be done. If it comes to regulated financial undertakings who provide loans or credit or other financial services, they only need to do it when they conclude new contracts. These periodic reassessments, they can be done also with tools. There's quite some tools on the market today and technologies, but they can also be done on site. Like, for example, one of our Belgian clients entered into a contract with a French company for the delivery of e-meters, electronic meters. To manufacture these meters, you need chips. The French company entered into a contract with a Chinese company because the chips were going to be manufactured in China. Although there had been, in the pre-contractual phase, assurances and everything was checked, they were abiding with the codes of conduct, with the due diligence policies. When a team was sent to the factory in China, and during the life cycle, during the execution of the contract, they had discovered that the workers were working 12 hours a day. 12 hours a day, that's not, of course, what we would do. And then, of course, there was a problem. So there was a report stating that now, after monitoring, after checking, that the Chinese factory, that the workers were working 12 hours a day. Then they tried to mitigate, they tried to solve it. But the problem was that the people working in the factory basically wanted to continue because they got huge premiums if they worked longer. But the French and the Belgian company finally decided to end the contract because they didn't want to work with a sub-supplier who was not abiding to their code of conduct. And this, of course, was an adverse impact on human rights. And that's, you can do the next slide. That indeed is, these are actually some recommendations that can be done to companies when they want to put third-party verifications of third parties whom they want to be want to conclude a contract. And training is also very important. Training of your own people, your own employees, and also training of third parties. Of course, the question will always be, who will pay all the costs? And like the directive provides also, when it comes to SMEs and when third parties need to do the verifications, the audits, that it should be paid by the main contractor, by the manufacturer, but not by the SME. That will be different when it comes to large companies, which also, not to forget, if you want to do these audits, independent audits should also be put in the contract, that it can be done on site, whenever tools you want to make, but that these very independent verifications can take place. Can do the next slide. There was, as I said, the dynamic due diligence, it doesn't stop before the contract, but it goes on until the end of the contract. You can do the next one. Yeah, same, next one. And last but not least, if you have then decided if you continue with a third party or if you end your contractual relationship because there is no improvement, there is the publicity. But the proposal does not provide new reporting obligations than the ones which already provided in the CSRD. But when it comes to in-scope companies and which do not fall under the CSRD, they will have to publish an annual statement on their website. The content will have still to be defined by the European Commission, but it will have to be published on the 30th of April each year. But a lot of companies have not waited to see what they need to publish and do publish already a lot of due diligence reports on their websites. So there's still a lot that needs to be defined, that needs to be figured out. But in any case, it will be quite an exercise for companies to put these due diligence in place. It will also be even more difficult for SMEs because they will be impacted. There will be huge costs related to all this due diligence, and not only the due diligence processes, but also the compliance and the monitoring of it, sending people on site to see whether there is complied with or not, preparing reports, taking the decisions to continue with your third party, yes or no. It will be something that is work in progress. I thank you all for listening this afternoon, and if you would have any questions, happy to answer them.